Hello, in this video we're going to talk about the diphthongs of American English mostly, and we're going to highlight the most important ones from your assigned reading in chapter 12. So as just a reminder, those are some of the qualities of monothongs versus diphthongs. So when we're talking about diphthongs, we're talking about vowels that we consider to be a single sound segment, but the tongue is moving throughout the production. Right? And then when we talk about diphthongs, we're going to symbolize that by using a symbol for each end of this movement, where the movement starts and where the tongue sort of ends up. Right? It's sort of using that two-dimensional system that you've learned about with monothongs. So we're going to show sort of the starting point, how front versus how back a vowel is at the beginning versus how high it is, and then where it is in those dimensions at the end. And you can write these symbols with a little tie bar, which would look like a little like sort of rainbow type shape over those two symbols, but that's totally optional. That does not matter how you write it for me, as long as I can tell the diphthong that you are writing. It's more important to get the symbols right than anything else. Okay, so we have different ways of classifying the diphthongs. I don't know if you can hear that, but there's some sort of emergency going outside my office window. That's why I paused. But I think it's gone. There are some sirens there. All right, so how we classify them. We have different ways of talking about, it's either the duration, how long each sort of portion of the diphthong is, or which direction the tongue is moving. So our main ways are, for the movement, are these first three types: closing, opening, or centering. And closing is whether the tongue is raising in the mouth. And this is what's going to apply to most of the American English vowels we're talking about here. And closing, you can think about it as what is also used as a term for high vowels. You can also call them close, and that can help you remember that closing refers to those that go with the tongue starts down somewhere but ends up in a higher position in the mouth, like this one right here, which is I. Our opening diphthongs would be ones where the tongue is lowering in the mouth. So it starts out, if I switch to my schema here, if it starts out up here and the tongue ends up lower, then that would be a lowering or a opening diphthong. Right? And we don't really have that in English, or at least in American English, what we normally know. But there's one example here of one that starts out with an oo and ends up, so oo is a high back vowel, and it ends up as a, that mid-front vowel. So if you try and say oo and go to a, then you get that diphthong, ue, right? Not something that we have as a vowel, something we recognize as being a phoneme in English, but possible to say that. Ue is how that symbol is written there. Right, the other possibility, and we have this, we'll talk about this in more detail later, this possibility, and it depends a lot about dialect, is a centering diphthong, where the tongue is moving from sort of those outer boundaries of the vowel quadrilateral to the middle of the quadrilateral, to that center space where we've got our rhotic sounds and schwa. Right, so a centering diphthong might look like this one. It starts out high front like this I, and it ends with a schwa and yeah. Right, and it would go, the tongue would start out in position for this and end up somewhere closer to the center of the vowel space. And finally, we have our falling and rising diphthongs, and that is just differentiating which part of the diphthong is longer. All right, so you can have either that first part, which we sort of symbolize with a symbol here in this chart. We show that here. Let's say for I, you can say this part is longer, that I, and then that little I at the end is really short. Or you can say, and that would be a falling diphthong, where that first part's longer. Or you could say a diphthong maybe is rising, where that second part, that second symbol or the last part of the diphthong is really the one that sticks out the most. So in that case, I here would be more like I, right? So that second part would stick out more if it was rising. And you can show the difference here with these little diacritics here. Those little, they look like little half circles. And this is the same thing we talked about before. If you drew it over top of the symbols, we talked about using a tie bar. This is the tie bar. It looks like that, right? But the little half circle, as it's shown here, is just a way of showing which part of the diphthong is shorter than the others. So you can consult your IPA chart and your diacritics about that, right? So those are similar looking but mean different things. Right, and so we talked about things being longer at the beginning or the end, and a more elegant way to talk about that is to give those parts of the diphthong a name. And those two possible names we have are on-glides or off-glides. Sort of think like Karate Kid, wax on, wax off. That wax off comes second, so that means our last part of the diphthong. An on-glide is our first part. Fairly simple. And in American English, you'll find that for diphthongs, the on-glide is always the most prominent. So you make note of that here in your notes. Right, it's always our first part that sticks out. We say I, not I, or that would just sound weird to us. And for the most part, there's some debate over how diphthongs function, and part of the variation you'll see in how people transcribe is some people will not transcribe diphthongs necessarily the way we are doing it. Some people transcribe some of these as a monophthong, but there are reasons for that that we can get into more in speech science. But generally the ones that are the least controversial that people agree on, although they may use different symbols, are I here, ow, and oi. And to illustrate what we mean by phonemic is whether it's going to change the word if you leave out part of the diphthong. So let's look at this little oi here and think of a slightly different word. You can consider the example I've given here in the slide, but think of a word like join. It's got that oi sound in there, and it ends with an n. But what if you left out that I part and you just said John? John. It would sound like sort of a weird version of John, but it wouldn't really quite sound like join anymore. It wouldn't be a word that you would likely recognize as being join. So in that case, it really makes a difference for the meaning of the word, and a good argument for why it would be phonemic, since we define phonemes as those sounds that are essential for the correct meaning to be heard by the listener. Okay, so now we're going to get into just briefly describing each diphthong. And as before, I'm going to show you slightly different. I've given you more informative slides for your reference, but to speed things up, we're not going through all those. What I want you to pay attention to right now is the articulation of each diphthong. You've been given some other information such as allophones that we will not cover at this time. That's later in the course. Some common misarticulations that also are not things that we need to cover at this moment. All right, so you can keep that for your own reference and focus on just how these sounds are articulated for now. But this is all of our sounds that we're going to focus on the most, and then we're going to talk about a few other ones that come up. And you can see how each of these diphthongs look in the vowel space. All right, so it goes from the starting point here, like O, and ends up in Here's the second symbol. So that's what each of these little symbols and arrows mean, where your tongue starts out and where it sort of ends up by the end of that diphthong. Okay, so the first one is A. So these symbols are pronounced A, and we are going to call that a front mid-closing diphthong. And we can call it a front because that first vowel, A, is like a mid-front vowel, and as that tongue moves, it sort of stays in that front area throughout. So it ends up in a direction of the vowel here, I. And like all these American English diphthongs we're focusing the most on, they are all closing, meaning that that tongue is going up as raising in the mouth. All right, a second one, this is I that we already talked about. So those symbols are pronounced I, and that one is a front low closing diphthong because we're starting with this vowel, which is slightly different than what we talked about in monophthongs, because this one represents a low front vowel. We've talked about being a low back vowel. This is slightly different, further closer to the front of the mouth. And the tongue moves from the position for that vowel towards I, as well as some of these other ones we're going to talk about. They all sort of end in the same area. And like all of them, they are closing. The tongue is raising up towards that roof of the mouth. Right, the next one, this is oi, as in boy. Right, and that one is called a fronting closing diphthong because it's a little bit unique. It's the only one where you can, if we go back to the vowel quadrilateral here, you can see that oi kind of crosses the whole entire vowel space, just about. Other ones, they move up in the mouth, but they sort of stay in that same area. But oi goes, all the way from back to front. So we give it that name of a fronting diphthong. But the tongue is also moving up higher in the mouth, so we also call it closing. All right, this one is ow, as in cow. And this one is moving from, that low front position. So we call, and to that, sort of that high back position, we call that So we can call the whole thing a back low closing diphthong. All right, the next one is O, and this is one where you'll commonly see this just written as a monophthong, just with O. But in American English, it's often produced as a diphthong, so a lot of phoneticians prefer to transcribe it this way. And it is a back mid-closing diphthong. All right, the last group of diphthongs we're going to talk about are centering diphthongs, where, like we mentioned before, it means that the vowel sort of starts out on that periphery of the vowel quadrilateral, but ends up somewhere in the center. And for most dialects of English, that's because of some sort of central vowel, and it may be, in the case of most American English dialects, a rhotic vowel, which is also in the center area. So sometimes we can talk about vowels in English being like these here, where we're starting with ah and or ah and almost the same. But those would all be British English versions of far, where there's no at the end. Fa. Right? So we end with more of a schwa, like an sound at the end of that diphthong. But for American English, except for a few isolated, well, I shouldn't say isolated, a few areas in New England where there's some, we call them non-rhotic dialects because they get rid of this. But for most of us, we say things with that sound. So cart is R, and that's transcribed here in the middle. Barn is arn as well. So we've got this sort of R. And so we start out with an and we end with an And care, we sort of start with an and we end with the care. Right? And those are our rhotic diphthongs. And some people will sometimes transcribe these a little bit different. We'll talk about some variations within class, but as long as you put something rhotic there, like an R or this little schwa symbol, that's what I want. We'll talk about what's acceptable in terms of transcription conventions in class, or you can let me know what your questions are. Try and think of a few examples where you think you might be able to use this kind of diphthong. And let me know in your warm-up what questions you have on this topic.